Welcome everybody. Today should be very interesting. Welcome Defender Friday. So, as usual, kind of here's a disclaimer of what this is. We at Leave It Charlie talk with interesting people in the industry all the time. There's all kinds of people doing all kinds of totally different stuff on the defender side of the equation in cybersecurity. So we just wanted to go and have those interesting conversations, both with those people and the rest of the community as well. So we welcome, people joining us. If you have questions, you want to, jump into the conversation. This is meant to be a pretty informal discussion, not just a single keynote kind of thing. So today we've got Jacob Salassi. Is that the premise?
That's right.
Awesome. And I think the sort of like the tagline of what you wanted to talk about is eliminating direct interactive access to production systems.
Yeah.
So this sounds like a good thing, a patently good thing, but I'm also curious on the spin that you're bringing to it. So maybe start with a quick intro on your side.
Sure. For the last 5 years or so, I was leading product security at Snowflake. I won't go into too much there, but we own security for the whole product, abuse, threat detection, incident, the whole thing. And so, of course, one of the things we focused a lot on was the production infrastructure, how it was accessed, and things like that. And there are also some unique. If you look at GCP, for example, they have features like access transparency. Eventually, you get big enough that customers come asking you, like, "Hey, how can I see what you guys are doing in the product?" Sort of above and beyond things. So I guess that's sort of the context of like. In my past life, I was in a place that had a strong incentive from its customers first, and then the broader market later to sort of respond to everything else to say, like, how can we think about production access and showing it to people? And if you're me and you're thinking, oh, we need to show our production access to people, that really sets you thinking about like, well, what are we doing in there? And would we want to show that? And, if we had to show it to everyone, would we be proud of what we were showing? You know what I mean? I don't mean to diminish or suggest anything weird was going on, but it's like, hey, in the very early days, it's like you log in to debug stuff a lot. And it's like, maybe that's not the practice we want to have when we go and start sharing these things publicly. So yes, it was like an interesting two-pronged attack, right? Where you would say, hey, I would love to reduce risk. And what I'll say is if you can find a customer tie-in to your risk reduction efforts, all the better for you. Right. So more recently, I've just been doing my own thing with some friends, learning about security problems. Not really what I'm here to talk about, but yeah, that's a little bit about me. Before Snowflake, I worked at a company called Collective Health doing AppSec, and before that, I was just a hacker, network engineer, and like a support guy. And through some lucky stuff and hard work, I started in a developer job. And from there, I pivoted into to security as an actual job that paid me rather than just something I did on the weekends. So,
Awesome.
Yeah.
I go for it.
Okay. So I'll just say a couple things, and then, like you said, the last one of these I was on, there were a lot of people talking, so I hope that still happens. I just wrote a couple of notes for myself to just kind of go through my ideas, but. It's funny, I was having a conversation, a quasi-discovery conversation with an engineer, and we were just talking about various problems, and they mentioned, teleport. I think when a lot of people think about what am I doing about production access, maybe like two things come to their mind. Bless the good old Netflix cert-auth, SSH cert-auth scheme, and teleport. And neither of those things do anything indirect at all. But like when you think about production access, or if I've done something different from production access, maybe you used Bless or maybe you used teleport. I think as you get bigger, things like I just described happen. First of all, you say, gosh, forgetting about security for a minute, if I have to log into if I have to directly interact with my product in production to support it, there's a high probability that I'm going to make an error that is going to impact production. And that might just mean you cause an outage, has nothing to do with a security incident. So there's sort of that thing happening. And then there's an overall desire, right? Like we said, we kind of got to push from our customers and our own desire to meet where the rest of the market was. I could see that not our competitors, our quasi-competitors in this case, had the ability to introspect production access. And we also thought, kind of like I said earlier, if we can kind of associate this with customer need, then we'll have a strong incentive to be able to get the business to invest in this. But I guess what I'll start with is some beliefs. One, I don't think like everybody everywhere needs to think about eliminating all production access. I think you should be making intentional decisions as you grow bigger. That would maybe allow that to be easier. That's the best thing you could do. But I think like a lot of things I learned at a large hyperscale company, like it doesn't always apply to you, and you shouldn't always do it first. I'm not saying you shouldn't look at production access, but like kind of some of the things I'm talking about here are when you're operating at a larger scale. So I'll also say this. I think it's an unrealistic goal to say I'm going to have like zero production access. Like that's not a thing. Stuff's going to happen. You're running a business. Your job as a security team is to help the business succeed. Maybe it sounds cliche, whatever, but like you're not here to, make it impossible to support the product. That's a non-goal of something like this. So you got to start with not having a goal of zero, but instead of minimizing it. And there's kind of three main use cases that I saw in my experience. There's probably more. Yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So one of the questions in the chat was about defining the tiers of access. So hopefully I'm going to start talking a little bit about that now, and we can jump some more into that. So I think of three main use cases. Debugging production issues, which I've talked about. So these are maybe infrastructure or engineering teams. Two is tuning parameters. These might be infrastructure, engineering teams, or support teams. And then three is customer support itself. You can kind of spiral further into things like user provisioning and other stuff that might happen on your platform. But to me, you can just sort of broadly define production access is anything that mutates production state. So it's the hosts, it's the cloud infrastructure, it's your application and its business logic itself, if it exposes those types of tunable parameters or state mutating changes, which I think the vast majority of services do something like that on the back end. So you might automate things like user and account provisioning, but when you stand that customer up, like how many times do you have to go and tune parameters specific for a customer in a deployment? At least twice in my past lives, that's absolutely been something that happened. You stand up a tenant, that tenant has some unique need distinct from other tenants, and now I've got to go tune that particular tenant configuration. And I think people don't necessarily think about these kinds of things when they think about production access. You also got to think about what happens when a customer, right, calls support with a major issue. What do you do with the logs you get from them? You get octed. And what do you do with the information about the data you're accessing on behalf of them? So you might say, hey, send me the logs from your client, and I'm going to combine that with the logs I'm going to scrape out of your production account, right? And so there's also the thought about what about the logs of my accessing the customer's data or metadata, for example, to investigate an issue. So right, anything that can mutate production state. And I think the reason I kind of harp on this, and maybe what M. Cohen, I don't know your first name, sorry, is that it's not something you're going to do alone. And it's not something you're just going to do with the engineering team. I think you might be surprised to learn that it's something you're going to do with engineering infrastructure and support teams, and maybe even more teams, depending on how your business operates the product. But in my experience anyway, it was those three key players. And the surprise for me was the amount of time we needed to spend with support. So I'll pause there for a minute because I want to sort of talk about like the loop we ran with each of these stakeholders to start even trying to tackle this problem. Any questions or comments on anything so far?
Well, I'm kind of intrigued, particularly because to kind of get your take on that. But I think sometimes it's easy for us to think in terms of this production access as like SSHing into a box. But the reality is that especially with cloud providers today, in a way, like people preach like infrastructure as code and like all these great things that allow you to not have prod access. But at the same time, they try to make it really, really, really easy for you to have prod access, right, through their web interface. And so anyway, I think it's going to be interesting to kind of get from your take where that line comes in with like modifying prod, but also through the ways that those providers like actually try to funnel you to do it. So anyway.
Yeah. So I think if maybe an example is, AWS CLI run on, infrastructure engineer's laptop, that is absolutely production access for me. I think and I'll go back to kind of what I said. It's as big as you think it is. Anything that mutates production state, and I guess you would say, well, what's production? It's the infrastructure, it's the services, it's the application, it's everything that's required to deliver the service. And I don't think it's controversial. I'm trying to cast the widest net possible because I think maybe to your point, folks maybe, and I certainly did think about it myopically as like, oh, host access, but no, it was host access, it was cloud access. And it was a couple of different ways, both from an administrative perspective in the engineering team, how you configure the product, and then from a customer support perspective, how they configure and interacted with the product. And so there were at least 4 different interfaces, host, cloud, thing 1 for controlling the product and thing 2 for controlling the product. And all of that was production access. And then there's even another tier of stuff where you say, what about all of the logs? In a lot of cases, you're going to be storing logs. Customers know what's being logged and all that stuff. So no funny business there, but like that's got to go somewhere. And what about accessing that? Is that production access? In my mind, it was, because these were all artifacts of delivering the production service. And so all of these things were potentially toxic if someone had unfettered access to them and was just rolling through there. So we even considered access to the telemetry and distinct types of telemetry that came out of the product. For example, if your product had an ability to log the commands that customers were running, that is something that you definitely would want to protect and think about, how do I mete out access to that? And do I need to give anybody access to that anyway, or can I think about other ways to do it? So how do you even start, right? We talked about like, oh gosh, so many different ways, so many stuff that can happen and so many different, okay. So obviously you got to do some kind of inventory exercise. And like me, you'll make some decision about things that are in or out. We cast a pretty wide net because we thought about all the inputs and outputs into production. That's an easy way to just say that's everything we want. Then what you have to say is, well, how, what does that even mean? Because, let's say, and hypothetically, you're having this is not a real number, but just to make it easy to talk about, I have 100 SSH sessions a week into production. What do I do to drive that down? Pretty sure you're going to go talk to the 100 people that did that and be like, hey, what'd you do? What'd you do? That's one way to do it. But you need instrumentation of some kind. And so I'll sort of come all the way back to Teleport because that's where our journey started, which was like, hey, first, we started to focus on people accessing hosts. So that was the main thing we wanted to get rid of first. And so instrumenting Teleport to take in a justification, in other words, like a JIRA ticket, and then a use case. And just starting by finding these quote unquote choke points, or non-choke points as it were, because if the key problem with host access is like, can you do it from any laptop, or can you do it from a few laptops, or whatever? So you essentially needed telemetry everywhere to figure out why all the people who could access it were accessing it. You start to aggregate that data. You do the same thing for whatever the parameters running, however it is your product maintains parameters, however support accesses things. You kind of come and introduce this idea of justification and use case. And that allows you to have them try to declare to you, I'm doing this thing that I think we do often. And then you also have an ability to say, I can look deeper into what you are doing through a lineage in a JIRA ticket where you justified this access, and maybe I can ask more questions later. So we first started by instrumenting all of these layers and then measuring that data and saying, okay, what were all the justifications we saw? What were all the reasons? How many times was it no reason found, and that kind of thing, and just sort of put the data together and focused on the ones that we understood best and then the ones that we understood least. So for example, where someone was not able to select a valid use case, for example, obviously we want to go and figure out what it is you're doing so that we can make that an option. But I think, I don't know if it's tricky, but when you think about, oh, okay, I have all of these accesses, am I just going to prioritize the most frequent one first? Not from a security risk perspective. Like, frequency is not always about what the risk is. So what we did was we sort of went back and scored each of these methods with some kind of arbitrary risk number. Like, hey, if you are SSHing directly into a host, that's more risky. And if you're performing this activity, maybe that's more risky, whatever. And so then you can just kind of combine doesn't have to be perfect, but frequency times risk. And that was how we kind of stack ranked. Okay, here's where the biggest ROI is going to be. We're going to look for the most dangerous things that happen the most often. And then we're going to have a list of those things. You'd say, oh, great, I have a list of bad stuff. What do I do next? Then you come to the engineering part of things, where you say, so there's a question here about what about the management and the provisioning of that access? So I think that is a great question, and I'm actually not going to cover that too much here. And what by saying that, I don't mean that that's not important. I would say that there's like two legs of this. But let's operate under the assumption for a minute that you are using the access we intended you to have, and you're trying to do now a legitimate activity. That's not a safe assumption. I'll just say like, that's a separate problem, and you should go and think about that and have a strategy for that. What I would say is, I'm not going to talk too much about that unless we come back to it later. So again, not to diminish the importance of managing access. You should have ephemeral time-bound access to everything, but it is adjacent to this problem.
I'm kind of curious because I think it's like sort of like parallel to this, but I'm curious to get your take on like the alternate approach to this, which could have been, hey, we're going to create a well-known path to have those accesses and a process around that. And you kind of touched on it on like the ticket, side of things, like linking that,
Sure.
and then make that an enforcement method.
Yeah.
And then backtrack from that. Instead of saying, well, we're going to start by just observing everybody and kind of trying to do it's sort of like top down versus bottom up. I'm curious why was there a specific reason you decided to go bottom up instead of top down?
So if I understand your question, I think you're asking me like, when did escorted access come into your mind, and would escorted access have been a way to also get the same data? Is that kind of what you mean? Like in the sense that, well, I'll let you respond to that so I make sure I understand your question.
Yeah, it's not even about getting the data. It's sort of looking at it from the other perspective, saying, hey, there's 100 SSH a week that come in.
Yeah.
We could go and we could instrument a whole bunch of things to slowly start to understand the scenarios and reverse engineer why those are happening. Or we could make this one enforcement process and then tell people, if you need SSH access, you go through that process. And then you end up, people are probably frustrated in the first week. They're learning the new mechanism to go and get access. But then the beauty of it is now you have all authoritative information right off the get-go. You don't have to try to reverse engineering what's happening, and you get enforcement. Like it feels like it, but it might be a size of organization thing.
I guess I'm not sure we didn't, or I still need to understand what you mean. The way it really played out is we said, hey, teams, why don't you tell us what you think you're doing when you access production? And that went into a spreadsheet. And then we stuck that into the enum for use case. And then we said, okay, everybody use teleport. That's the way. And that is why I deflect hard on the problem that M. Cohen asked, because essentially with teleport, you could be guaranteed that it was octa-auth and that all of the goodness after that was taken care of. So you're like, great. So long as you're using teleport, I know I have your group membership and all. Like, it's not SSH with a key. It's not SSH with a username password. So the main funnel was teleport itself. And you could say, well, maybe there's a better way to think about this, Jacob. I'm like, hey, great. Maybe we should have thought harder about it. But we sort of thought like, we killed bastions and gave everyone teleport. And now we're in this world of teleport and we're thinking, actually, this is not better. Bastions could have been better, but teleport is kind of the bastion now. So let's think about, for everyone who uses teleport, how can we measure that thing? And I guess the only part I'm reacting to is we didn't really reverse engineer it so much as we asked the teams to fill it out, provided them a form of what they filled out, and then focused on what were the deltas, and then making, in other words, where someone was doing something that wasn't in the list. And then we just focused on those teams saying like, hey, what is the way that we should do this? Or, hey, let's group these two things together. So maybe that's just how it played out for us. But I don't know, did I get it what you were asking?
Mostly, I think I was just taking it one step further, which is my understanding, and I might be wrong, was that somebody could still use teleport without filling in those tickets. And what I was going to was No, nobody can use teleport. Like the ticketing system is the one that ends up giving you a 1 hour access through
Okay,
teleport.
yeah. So it wasn't quite that advanced, but in the sense that we changed the deployed artifact on the endpoints, and it required you to supply justification and a ticket. The negative case was we knew we were going to fail open. In other words, we knew that you had to supply a valid JIRA, which we could validate through a fairly simple, straightforward call, and just say you had to have a JIRA. But what we could not do necessarily was know a priori the entire list of enum for use case. So then there was just like a not present. I don't remember exactly what the value was. So that just meant we targeted heavily anytime we saw that, or yeah, basically that, because the rest of them were kind of known to us, and we had had a conversation with these teams, and we had already talked about like, okay, let's deduplicate these two are the same thing, or that's too broad, we need to be able to differentiate between these two use cases, let's expand the enum. But yeah, the basic gating we put in is you have to supply the JIRA, and you have to select something from the enum, but you can select none from the enum, and then great, you can access things. Now, to your other point, thinking about cloud and everything else, like you're not even tackling that problem yet, because teleport doesn't do it, and you have to invent one of these things, and you have to place the mechanism on each endpoint. So it started here. And so maybe, I think someone said, I have not talked about escorted access before. So let me kind of just run through what indirections look like. Because escorted access is, I'll start there. To me now, like it's the worst state you should tolerate. And I think, Maxime, this is going to come to what you said. Escorted access basically means someone else is going to see what I'm doing. And however you choose to implement that, there will be two pairs of eyes on the terminal. You will declare a priori what it is you're going to do. The same person who's going to watch you do it is going to peer review you doing that. And now two of you are going to lay hands. One is going to lay hands on production, and the other one is going to watch you lay hands on production and make sure that what you did fits into the constraints of what you said you were going to do. Now, that's not a perfect system, because we've all debugged things. Like if I describe 10 steps and I realize I need 11, you have to have some flexibility there. But like the base case is you don't access production alone without auditability and without observation. So I think that's kind of the base case people can aspire to. If you say, I did nothing else for my production access except make it observable and auditable, I think that would be really good. And it's not actually super challenging, because if you can go back and look at these things, you're in good shape. But ideally, you want someone there sort of agreeing that, like, yes, let's push enter on that command. As painful as that might sound, I think that's like actually a pretty reasonable place to start. Coming up from that, and that's not an indirection, right? That is escorted. It is direct in every way, but it is through a single mechanism, one choke point now that has all the instrumentation you need to monitor it. It is, but it is in a lot of cases, if you have an on-call, someone says, sounds very hard to scale. If you're at scale and you have on-call, there's already 2 engineers on call, which makes escorted access actually not that difficult to do, because both of them are working on this, and you're basically saying you're just going to have one other of the on-calls pay attention to what you're doing while you two are debugging this thing. The other things you start to think about are great. I would much rather extend on this idea of saying what I'm going to do and then only doing that. And Maxime, you talked about infrastructure as code. And so you can also think about like commands as code. You can think about a system that we did not invent. We didn't do this, but it's just a useful analog. It's like, I'm going to submit a shell script, and then that shell script is going to be run on my behalf. So that is an indirection, but kind of sketchy in the sense that the input is unconstrained. I have an unconstrained input of arbitrary code, but I don't get to press enter on that. I get to submit it to a broker, a proxy, whatever you want to call it, and it gets executed on my behalf. So that's maybe now like the worst case of indirection, but something you still need to think about. Then there are sort of like, I'm going to go to a terminal, I'm going to type in my script, and then I'm going to click, and it's going to get executed. Now, that should obviously be peer reviewed. There's sort of a better version of that where I have to commit my script to a repository a priori and have that peer reviewed, and then only that script that has been peer reviewed and committed is allowed to be executed. That's like the next worst. We're starting from the bottom worst solutions you can have for this. A formally defined script that is checked in, so infrastructure as code style. Moving up the stack, and where we spend a lot of our time, is push buttons, right? Like, I don't want you to define anything. I want you to push a button and hopefully supply 0 arguments to that button. But you can think about a push button with dynamic arguments. That's the worst kind of button you can invent. It's a button, but I give you the arguments. A better kind of button is one that you push that has a couple of drop downs and you can select a few arguments, right? That's even better. And the best button has no arguments at all, which is like, just dump those logs from that host and stick them on this bucket where I can access them. That's kind of the classic. I can push a button to do that. I can push a button to dump a core. I can push a button to do other things, right? Where typically to dump a core, you might have SSH'd in, you might have, ran gcore on a process, you might have collected that core and transferred it off the host. So like those kinds of things are actually, depending on your service, may be common and actually super easy to get rid of. They create a second problem of like, how do I allow people to examine core files? But let's put that aside. One of the questions in the chat is, but can you cover all the use cases? No, which is why I said at the beginning, like, you can't have a goal of 0. You will provide break glass access. You will definitely need to plan for that. And in the best case, all of your break glass access will be escorted and instrumented so that you can measure that and see, like, are we having common break glass cases execute over and over and over? How can I build something to abstract those? But you will never, ever, in my belief, get away from break glass access. And that is because either you cannot scale for everything or you should not scale for everything. Like, I don't think you need to build for every single use case that can ever happen. You need to build for the most high value, highest return on investment use cases. What I think, and Maxime, you were talking a little bit about this, is however you do this, however the button is and however many arguments or the scripts, I think what's really important to understand is you're taking a many-to-many problem and you're making it a few-to-many problem, in the sense that, like, how many endpoints can make access and how well instrumented are those? And when I say endpoint is maybe the wrong term, how many things can access? It may not be an endpoint. You can think of it like a dedicated terminal that you're going to take some action on. You could maybe take any action you want, but if I guess taking a government example, there's classified computers you sit at, you got to do your searches on. They, everything is monitored. Bad stuff can still happen. People screenshot it, they print stuff, they leak it out, but they typically find out because there was one choke point. You had to come into this room, sit in front of that computer, and we knew who you were, and we could look at what you did later. I think it's important to think in terms of this. It's not that you need to eliminate everything. It's that you need to get yourself in a position to see everything and to see everything reliably. And then what you can do is make it easier to see by turning it into a button or a button with arguments, and those things you need to pay attention to less, versus the more free-form things you'll know you want to spend more time paying attention to those. So that, at least that's my response in terms of how you think about trying to cover everything. You don't. You think about constraining the access to the fewest number of secure terminals and then monitoring those terminals heavily. So let's see. I think to talk about like the approaches that we saw. So Sandshell is an open source project. It's in the Snowflake Labs repo. I'm not representing Snowflake. I don't still work for Snowflake. I'm only speaking hypothetically. I'm not talking about how they did anything, but it's open source. They use Sandshell. That's not a secret. What Sandshell is kind of an implementation of this idea that it is a gRPC server and proxy, and you can send commands and it executes commands on your behalf. Like, I don't think it's any more important than that. You write it and go. And the concept is that you've created something somewhere that accepts commands, executes commands on someone's behalf, does all the auditing stuff, and it is the only one that can touch the infrastructure. So Sandshell was something we created to replace direct access to the hosts if you needed to run a predefined set of stuff. Teleport, remained to exist and still had justification in those things because we, like I told you before, break glass was not a goal. Like, eliminating break glass was not a goal that we had. It was more to minimize the use of break glass. When you think about cloud access, it's not different, but we rather the solution was a cloud access proxy. And I think I think Vault has some capability in this regard, but anyway, it was something that was built internally and was not open source as far as I know. But essentially the same idea, an RPC server that interacts with all the cloud providers and has a predefined set of commands that you're allowed to run against it. And then we had a service, the name I won't mention, internally that faced when the product was being configured from a engineering level, tuning parameters and those things. There was a service specific to that that had an array of buttons that were exposed that you could press and provide arguments to. And then lastly, support had another system that did exactly the same thing, that sat in front of those log data sources and made sure that they're accessed in context and that only the things you need are returned. Or at least these are some of the ideas that we had in terms of solving these problems.
Sorry, we're about at time. So I think this is a discussion that, yes, I agree. This feels like a fascinating thing we could discuss a lot more. Is there an easy way people can reach you? Any better way if they want to keep chatting about any of that stuff?
Yeah, for sure. LinkedIn is always an easy place to find me. And yeah, maybe that's the best place for folks to reach me, and then we can always move off of there as needed.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that discussion today. It was super interesting. I think it certainly brought some ideas to my mind. I was also thinking, like, maybe there's a business there for somebody to kind of provide a cohesive, opinionated way. I have no idea if that's anywhere you're going, but good luck with your startup. And thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming in. And we will see you next week. If you do want to also keep some of that discussion going, we do have community.limacharlie.com or .io. And yeah, we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.